Hello, my name is Lawrence Wolfen, and welcome back to a video study through the book of Hebrews. We're in the middle of Hebrews chapter 9, and most recently we've seen how Jesus Christ is a better high priest who has inaugurated a better covenant that is based upon better sacrifices, that being his own blood, which he offered in the true tabernacle, which is in heaven. As we continue on here, let's pick up in Hebrews 9, verse 15. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. A lot of things to break down here, and unfortunately I won't be able to dig in and get into everything. There are some pretty complex and technical things going on in some of this description here. Remember, we learned a few chapters back. Some of us are hard of hearing, but we've got to learn to grow in maturity. We've got to learn to grow and to be able to tackle some of the more complex issues of the Bible, but we may not have time to cover it in this video. When we see that Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, Moses being the mediator of the old covenant, the one who God used to help set up that covenant between himself and the people of Israel. Now, this new covenant we referred to before previously, and we saw how originally it was mentioned in Jeremiah 31, that God said, "I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." That covenant, Jesus is the mediator of. So he says that those who are called, referring to the Jewish people specifically, because those are the ones who were a part of the old covenant. The old covenant did not pertain to anyone outside of ethnic Jews. Those who are called, the Israelites, may receive the promised eternal inheritance. That is the purpose of the new covenant, right? That they can actually receive the eternal inheritance, not just the physical promises that God made, but the eternal inheritance, salvation, right? Because a death has occurred that redeems them from those transgressions which they committed under the first covenant. Again, only Jews were under the first covenant, so only Jews could be in view here from the author that he's saying have committed these transgressions based upon this first covenant. So Jesus' death has come, which can redeem them from the sins, from the mistakes made, from their failures to follow the first covenant. And then he gets into this little tricky phrase here. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. Essentially, he's establishing the fact that with most covenants, there is some sort of sacrifice, there is some sort of death associated with it, some sort of shedding of blood, as there was even with this covenant. You can go back and read about God through Moses establishing this covenant in the book of Exodus and see how Moses was required to kill an animal and take its blood, and he's put it on the people. He put it on the instruments that were going to be used in the tabernacle. He put it on the tabernacle. He put it on the book of the law itself. He's putting blood on all of this stuff. But here's really the point that we need to understand. That he says, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, because without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Right? This picture of blood being spread everywhere could be quite disturbing if we don't understand what's going on here. And that's the part that I think I want to focus on more than exactly what does he mean by there must be the death of the one involved in the covenant. Here's the deal, right? In Leviticus 17, God made very clear to establish that the life of something is in its blood. Blood is a representation of life. And in fact, most living things cannot, especially human beings, cannot live without blood. If you lose too much blood, you are not going to continue living. So that there needs to be, God told Adam and Eve in the garden that they would surely die for their sins. For sins to be atoned, for sins to be paid for, there needs to be a loss of life. A forfeiture of life comes because of sin. People have to give up their life. Well, in order for someone to then enter into a relationship with God, they have to, in essence, give up their life, which they cannot do to still be in a relationship with God. And so there is this shedding of blood. And so that blood of that animal, then that they were making the sacrifice and pouring the blood out before the altar or putting it on the altar itself, this shedding of blood represents taking the life of this animal in your place and putting it in your place. Or we see even like with the Passover story where they had to kill the lamb and put the blood on the doorposts. This was again showing that I've taken the life of this animal and it's representing the life of my firstborn. So that it's taking his place, so that God then did not kill the firstborn of those who lived in that household because they had the life of another to stand in their place. And so he said almost everything under the law is purified with blood because it needs this sacrifice of a life for a life to atone for it. Without this shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And of course, the ultimate reference we saw earlier in chapter 9, that Jesus offered his own blood, which was the holy blood, the blood of a sinless person, for the place to represent his life for the life of everyone. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. Verse 23, he says, "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites." So in the same way, the heavenly things have to be purified with this blood to represent the life of someone being spent. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, than the blood of the bulls and the goats and whatever, right? Verse 24, "For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." Again, Christ not entering into the earthly tabernacle, but into the true tabernacle, which the earthly tabernacle was based upon, to offer his own blood, a better sacrifice, and appear in God's presence on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. Right? Christ doesn't go in repeatedly, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world, because he's the only sufficient sacrifice. He would just have to be continually dying and offering up his blood. If his sacrifice wasn't good for all of time, right? Because he's got to, every time people are being born, he's got to be sacrificed to pay for their sins. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So by sacrificing himself, Jesus Christ does away with sin completely. There's no need for continual sacrifices now. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So he says here, look, it's a guarantee of two things in life are guaranteed. You will die and you will face judgment before God, right? It's appointed for man once to die and after that to face the judgment. After that comes judgment. So Jesus Christ, this is guaranteed as well, just as strongly as those are guaranteed. So Jesus Christ offered once to bear the sins of many, to carry the sins of the world, will appear a second time, right? He appeared the first time in order to provide that perfect sacrifice for sins. He now sits at God's right hand, serving as our great high priest, continually interceding on our behalf. But the second time, he doesn't come to deal with sin. That's already been taken care of. right? It's not like Jesus is returning to earth because there's unfinished business pertaining to his sacrifice. It wasn't good enough, like the earthly priest who had to continually sacrifice. No, Christ's sacrifice was good enough once for all, but he's coming a second time now to save those who are waiting for him. We talked about this, right? There's different dimensions of salvation. Christ has saved us from the penalty of sin. He is currently, day by day, saving us from the power of sin over our lives. And one day, he will ultimately save us from the very presence of sin. And that is what this refers to. Christ will come to fully complete the process of salvation, and remove us from the very presence of sin as he rules and reigns over a new heaven and a new earth, and he reigns in righteousness, right? And so we see that this entire section of Hebrews 8, 9, really going all the way back to 7, which if you want to look at it, goes really all the way back to 5. This entire section, we begin to see how Jesus Christ is a better priest than any of the priests that came before him. A priest like Melchizedek. A priest who brought in a better covenant that could actually bring salvation because his sacrifice is a better sacrifice once for all, not needing to be repeated over and over and over again. And it is only when we place our trust in that we can truly be saved. Otherwise, we're continuing to live in dead works that will get us nowhere. And so as these Hebrew Christians are suffering persecution and they're considering maybe we should just go back to our Judaistic way of life, this author of Hebrews is helping them to see that ain't going to get you nowhere. That life is not actually pointing you to a true relationship with God. It's an imperfect relationship based upon all these sacrifices and washings and cleansings that actually don't do anything as far as restoring you perfectly to a relationship with God. That covenant was for a place and time that God needed to instill that covenant, that he told his people, look, if you can keep these commands, you get the blessings of the covenant. But now there's a new covenant, a better covenant, that's not based upon a conditional promise. That's just based upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on behalf of sinners, that now by faith we can be made whole. We can be put into a right relationship with God on the basis of his blood. And we can know that even as we continue on this journey on earth after our salvation, that Jesus Christ sits at God's right hand as our great high priest, interceding for us continually. These are powerful truths. I know it's a lot, and we've got to take time to meditate on the full depth of some of this. But I hope and pray that something said today is ministered to your heart, and I hope and pray that you take it and share it with those around you. Thank you, and God bless.